With the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. This month we'll examine nonviolence. Nonviolence is often misunderstood. We'll explore what it really is and how it works. We'll share some practical examples from history, and we'll find out how we can promote it further. I'm happy to welcome Dennis Mills and Jody Tiller. Both are local folks active with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation and the local chapter of Veterans for Peace. They'll share their knowledge and their insights about nonviolence. Welcome. Glad you're both here.
Thank you for having us.
We will have fun.
Thanks.
It seems like before we can start understanding nonviolence, we should get a grounding as to what violence is, because violence can be different from how people understand it. Can you tell us something about...
Well, I'd be glad to share, and I'd also like Jody to share with me. And we actually have a PowerPoint slide that talks about what is violence. And when we hear the word violence, we really think physical violence. And that's where most of us hear about physical force used to hurt someone. And that's the most visible type, but there's more. One of that is psychological violence, where we make attack on another person's personal value or self-esteem. But there's also sexual violence, and we hear a lot of that in the news. And finally, there's economic violence. Perhaps one of the best definitions, Glenn, that I've found comes from the World Health Organization. Their definition was violence is the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself or another person or against a group or community that results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. So that's quite a big definition. That's why I want to leave it on the slide for just a moment or two. It's quite a definition of violence.
Pretty wide-ranging.
Yes, it is.
And so it gives us a reference point.
It's more than just physical, and we often think of physical violence
Right.
as in war, but it's more than that.
Right. And when we look at nonviolence, we'll see that nonviolence has a lot more breadth and depth to the meaning, a lot more richness to it. There are a lot of misconceptions about nonviolence, and I wonder if we could lay some of those misconceptions to rest. What misconceptions about nonviolence do you hear?
A primary one is the confusion between passivity and nonviolence. I think that so much of what we think of as nonviolence is really, so much of what is really passivity. And an example of this is taken from Jesus. He says, turn the other cheek. If you're hit, turn the other cheek. And it's been translated into just accept violence onto yourself without reaction. But during his day, you would never strike someone with your left hand. Your left hand was unclean. So you would only strike with your right. And you would only strike, so if you're striking someone on the right cheek, you're backhanding them.
Yeah. Well, the idea is it has to do with the status of the other person.
It does. If you're backhanding someone, you would do that to someone who's below your status. If you were a husband, you might do that to your wife or child, or a slave. If you were a Roman, you could do this to a Jew. An equal you would hit with your fist. So imagine that you backhand someone. And then
that's my right cheek then, if you're doing that. If you're a high-ranking person, I'm low-ranking.
I backhand you.
Yeah, that's my right cheek.
But then you stand there and offer the other cheek.
This one.
I can't backhand you because your nose is in the way. That means I would come around and hit you in the way that was meant that you were my equal. You're standing there, and I either have to not hit you or hit you as an equal. What you're doing is really powerful. It's not a passive act. But it's been translated into our culture as passivity.
So what it does is, if I'm turning the other cheek so that you have to approach me with the left, on my left cheek, it calls into question the status differential.
Yes.
And then I'm no longer a subordinate. I'm either equal status, or else you have to rethink, why am I hitting this person in the first place?
It causes you to stop what you're doing. And there's a good chance that in that society you would pay the consequence for this. You might be dragged off and flogged, but what you did was a powerful stance, and it might just start to change things.
You know, Glenn, another misconception is that nonviolence only equates with pacifism. In other words, we must all be pacifists in order to use nonviolent action. And we don't have to be pacifists or saints as such. Nonviolent action has been predominantly and successfully practiced by ordinary people, and we'll see that as we go on throughout the program.
Let's look at what nonviolence is and how it works. Some folks who have worked with the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta, Georgia, have distilled a lot of his writings and teachings to 6 basic principles of nonviolence. And I wonder if the both of you could
right. As a matter of fact, we'll share those principles as we go through. We do have a slide that we'd like to share with our viewing audience. And these are 6 principles of nonviolence that Martin Luther King based his whole work and his ministry on. The first big topic there for the principle of nonviolence is it offers a way of life for courageous people. We're not wimpy people. It's for courageous people.
Nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. It's not about seeing the other as enemy.
So it maintains the humanity of both parties rather than the dehumanization.
Exactly. And it seeks to defeat injustice, not people. Because many times we think of the word conflict, someone's going to have to win. Therefore, someone's going to have to lose.
So when Gandhi was working to free his country from British rule, he wanted them to leave as friends, as they did, and they did. They didn't leave as enemies.
There's another principle. Nonviolence holds that suffering can educate and transform. So there are people that do use nonviolence, and they will suffer, but it brings about a transformation in the other person.
You think about, for example, hunger strikes.
Yes.
Or going to jail for a worthy cause, or things of that sort.
Or just standing there when someone's about to hit you and standing strongly. Nonviolence chooses love instead of hate. So.
And finally, the 6th principle that Martin Luther King Jr. was for was nonviolence is a way of life that flows from a deep belief that the universe stands on the side of justice. And Glenn, you might refer to that because I've heard you use that term a number of times. So here's your cue to talk about the side of justice.
Okay. One of my favorite quotations from Martin Luther King, and there are many just amazing ones, is he often would say the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And as we all know from 10th grade geometry that we all stayed awake through, an arc is a line that has a little bit of curvature. It doesn't necessarily have to have very much curvature to it. And sometimes it seems like we're not making any progress at all toward justice. But there is that little bit of an arc to it. And he says the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. He believed that the universe was designed in a way that justice actually worked, and that the design of the universe was tending that way, that God was on our side as we worked for peace and justice and human rights and equality.
I think one of those misconceptions that you're bringing up is that we have this misconception it has to take a long time. But there are stories of it working in a couple of days or even immediately. It doesn't have to be this long arc.
It doesn't have to be, right,
yes.
but often it is. And what happens is people lose faith in nonviolence if they don't get immediate results. They say, well, we tried nonviolence for 6 months. Let's start shooting people or bombing things.
And then we have wars that go on for decades.
And we've been using wars for thousands of years, and all they do is cause more wars.
Yeah.
And I haven't yet heard the Pentagon say, we've been trying wars for centuries now in this country. That doesn't work. Let's try nonviolence for a change. Wouldn't that be great if Pentagon says, okay, enough of this violent stuff. Let's try nonviolence.
Yeah.
And we'll see that there are periods of history where actually nonviolence, the whole emphasis on nonviolence lasted longer historically than war, and who won in war and how long would that last before the next war began.
Can we share some stories about how effective nonviolence has been in history?
One of the hard ones to talk about is some of the nonviolence that worked in Nazi Germany. And what's hard about that is, once again, we look at what we've talked about being nonviolent, the Jews, but we see as passivity instead. But when they tried nonviolence, it actually worked. And one of those is known as the Rosenstrasse prison demonstration. In 1943, there were still Jews in Berlin. They were Jews of Aryan kin, which meant that they were husbands and sons of Aryan women. And they were still allowed in Berlin. But on this cold, dark night in February 1943, they were all rounded up and brought to the Rosenstrasse prison. Word went out around the city, and women started showing up in front of the jail. 6,000 women eventually stayed there. Now, the Gestapo headquarters was just a couple of blocks away, and Hitler was in town. He whose enormous will could make decisions like this couldn't make a decision.
He was the decider.
He was the decider. And the Gestapo couldn't make a decision what to do with these Aryan women who were creating a ruckus in front of the prison. So much ruckus that the prisoners inside were even starting to create a ruckus. Some of those prisoners had already been sent. Some of the Jewish men and boys had already been sent to Auschwitz or to another
the concentration
camp.
Extermination camp. Yeah.
The women stayed for days. One or two guns could have cleared the courtyard, but that's not what happened. The women stayed, and the Nazi Germany guards relented and released all of the men, even the ones who had been sent to concentration camps. Mm-hmm. They were given new clothes, sent back, told never to talk about what they had experienced. Now, what was expected to happen was over the next few days or months, these men would be rounded up and brought back. But there was a study done in the mid-90s that almost all of those men made it through the war. They weren't rounded up. Not only were those 6,000 men saved, but in the other cities, major cities in which they had the Aryan-related Jewish issue, like France or like Paris, they paid attention to what happened in Berlin. And so in all of those cities, the Jews were saved also. Mm-hmm. So these were untrained women who were just in love and saved their families.
Yeah, a lot of times, even though training in nonviolence is very helpful, a lot of times people can just intuitively know what they need to do and just do it without training. There's an example, I know a story that you and I both like to tell about Czechoslovakia in 1968,
yes,
where some spontaneous nonviolent work was really noteworthy. Yes. Tell us about that.
Oh, well, Czechoslovakia wanted more freedom than the Soviet Union wanted to give them, so they brought in their crack Red Army troops. Now, these weren't the tired troops of the 80s who had been through Afghanistan. These were troops that were on fire, and it was said that they would conquer the country in 4 days. But that's not what happened. The people refused to submit. They wouldn't pay attention to the curfews. They kept underground newspapers going, and the police delivered them. And they treated the invaders as if they were their friends. They talked to them. They gave them flowers. They invited them into their homes. And 8 months later, they still have their country. Eventually, they kept trading out the troops, and they brought in troops that didn't know the language, so they couldn't have the same relationship that the other troops had. And they did conquer the country. It only lasted for 8 months. But instead of 4 days, nonviolence gave them their freedom for 8 months.
Right, yeah, otherwise it would have been gone. And I know people would spontaneously take down the street signs, the Czech people, because they lived in Prague. They knew their way around the city that they lived in. But here's some Russian soldier with a map, and they can't find the right name or the right street because street signs are all down.
And they treated the Russian soldiers well enough that when they came into a store to get directions, they would stand gently in line, ask politely, get directions, and go on their way. That's how respectfully they all treated each other during that time.
And this was spontaneous without training. And then I know the experience has been when people are trained thoroughly, like with the civil rights movement in the South.
Yes.
And other times they can really withstand enormous provocation and problem.
Yes.
Well, that's actually a demonstration of how nonviolence really works. Nonviolent works really in this case of undermining the opponent's power at its very source.
Right, right. Yeah, you just refuse to accept.
When you realize they have the power and you refuse to give it to them.
Yeah, then they don't have the power anymore.
They don't have the power anymore.
And
You're taking it away.
You refuse to give up your humanity, and you refuse to take theirs.
That's right, right. Yeah. Why doesn't our society know these stories? These are things that are around and they're well documented, and there are lots and lots and lots of these stories around.
Isn't it wild? We all know how to read because we're taught how to write. We know how to fight because we're taught how to fight in our movies and in so much of our education. We aren't taught nonviolence. I think it's a critical component that's missing.
Well, and sometimes the print media and the film media and others are controlled by those whose interests are in the military complex, and they won't share that information.
It's the big movie houses, movie production studios, and the big book publishing and magazine publishing places. Those are all big businesses that are served well by the empire and the status quo and stuff.
I'll give another example. Missionaries taught the Chinese how to read, but it was the communists that came in that gave them reading material. And over a period of time, the people's minds had turned towards communism because that's what they had read. And I use that as an example to say, well, perhaps the reason that we're not reading and hearing more about nonviolence and its effect is there are those who do not want us to hear and see that message.
Yeah. And just even in school, the history books and the history classes all assume that history is all about wars and generals and battles and things, and they don't talk about things that happen with grassroots movements. They don't teach the labor movement as history with a bottom-up, largely nonviolent methodology, and they don't talk about so much about women getting the right to vote by having persisted for 70 years of nonviolently agitating and working and marching in the streets and all the things they needed to do. I mean, all these things are great nonviolent victories, but they don't say, wow, here's great examples of nonviolence.
So much of our country is founded on nonviolence, from the Boston Tea Party, which was destruction of property.
The Stamp Act?
Yeah, but refusal to pay the British stamp tax was nonviolent tax resistance. The first Continental Congress was a nonviolent action organization. This is, and it's, many historians say that we would have gotten our country sooner if we hadn't gone to war with them.
Because people were already boycotting the British court system, and they just set up their own parallel system. And this is one of the classic methodologies of nonviolence, is you ignore the official system and you set up your own parallel system, and you practice that rather than go to the official one. And there's a lot of tax resistance and a lot of those kinds of things. Refusing to put up in your home the British troops that were knocking on your door saying that that's where they're going to be living now for the next week or two. People said, no, you're not. So, I mean, lots of nonviolent resistance. if nonviolence actually works, why do we rely so heavily on violence instead of nonviolence? You have a quote from Gandhi, Dennis, about the effective use of nonviolence throughout history. It's a quote that I hadn't run into before until you showed that to me before we were when we were preparing for the program.
Yeah, I can't think of it right offhand, Glenn.
Well,
but it was a great quote.
It was, yeah. we will find that one of these days.
Yes, we will.
Okay. But basically, he was saying that if we had not been basically functioning in a nonviolent way, we would not have lasted.
Yeah, there wouldn't be humanity as we know it.
We couldn't do this.
Yeah.
We couldn't function in the violent way that lets violence take its course. That we have to be predominantly nonviolent in functioning. That's how we've been able to make it this many years.
It's taken cooperation to get here.
Yeah. There's you told me on the phone when we were preparing for the program about a civilization in Crete that had really a good long run.
5,000 years, no, in Czechoslovakia 5,000 years ago, and in Crete almost 3,000 years ago. For 1,500 years, both of these societies lived without war and apparently without violence. They had an equal distribution of wealth, as evidenced by what was buried amongst the men and the women. They had probably a matriarchal society, but it was a partnership society, where in our dominator society, you can see that male characteristics are often more highly cherished than feminine characteristics. That wasn't the case then. So equal distribution of wealth, lots of beautiful art, and their art did not focus on the violence, wasn't domination of nature. And in Crete, the area around them was warring for much of this time. They had trade relationships with the Mediterranean, and they maintained their nonviolence throughout.
Can you imagine, Jody, how a teacher, I'm a professor, so how would you taught history if I was in Crete during this whole time of nonviolence?
Yes.
You wouldn't be saying, well, I was born in World War so-and-so, I was raised in this war, my children are raised in the Cold War.
My father fought in this country.
Yeah, my father was a veteran, and my son is being drafted. None of that would have been in the Cretan language.
Yes.
Because it wouldn't have been taught. It wasn't part of their culture or society.
Wow.
Yeah, interesting. But the violence is so much embedded in our culture, and especially the militarism, that even the Air Force motto, I don't know if it still is, but it has been, peace is our profession.
Yes.
We just have to delude ourselves so much.
Well, that's why we have peacemakers too, and peacemakers are anything but peacemakers.
Yeah,
they're destroyers.
Yeah, the MX missile got that name. Let's explore how nonviolence works and why nonviolence works. Can either of you tell us something about, what it is about nonviolence that causes it to work? We touched on it a little bit earlier when we were talking about King's approach to it.
Well, also the fact that nonviolent struggle works because it undermines the opponent's power as its source. Government's political power, if you will, the power that we have right now and we all experience, ultimately depends on my consent and cooperation as a citizen.
So this is the Thomas Jefferson approach. It says we the people are in charge. And to meet the various needs that we have, we'll create this thing called government. And if it does what we want, that's okay. If it doesn't do what we want, we'll pull it down and replace it with something better that will meet our needs.
And it's further expanded with Gene Sharp, too, on all his points that he's made.
Yeah, and Gene Sharp has worked out of Cambridge, Massachusetts for decades. We already mentioned some work that he's done, but in the early 70s he published this 3-volume set about the politics of nonviolence, where the first volume sort of lays out the basic theory, which you've done more succinctly than he did. Second volume,
without the royalties too.
That's right. Yeah. And the second volume lays out 198 different methods of nonviolent resistance that people have used over thousands of years. And it's all the kinds of things that you think of, like marching and vigiling and boycotting and refusing to do this and refusing to do that and so forth. But also going places and doing pray-ins or sit-ins, or working when you're not supposed to work, or not working when you are supposed to work.
Or sitting where you're not supposed to sit.
Yeah, all those kinds of things. And he just lays these out and categorizes them, and then he shows historical examples of how these 198 things have worked.
And they're all doable.
They've all been done. They've all, and then the third volume pulls together some lessons from that. And he's written quite a number of books since then, and drawn from that kind of an approach, this very Thomas Jeffersonian sort of approach that says we the people actually have the power, and we can remove it from those who are exercising it in the government or in other oppressive
Well, rulers
entities.
of governments, political systems really aren't omnipotent, yet we have this perception that they are, and they don't possess self-generating power, although we give them that power, and so it would appear that they are the powerful and we are the weak.
Yeah. Well, we saw this in The Wizard of Oz. It turns out there's this little guy hiding behind a curtain pulling levers and things, and the little dog could pull the curtain back, and people say, oh, it's just this little guy pulling the levers and things. And that's really what it's about. If people quit believing in the power of those oppressors, their power just goes away. And people have done that in all kinds of settings. I mean, you told some stories about how folks were able to do that even in Nazi Germany, or even in Czechoslovakia in 1968 when the Soviet Union was dominating. This has happened in so many different settings universally.
13 countries in 1989 were released through nonviolence when the Soviet Union, the curtain collapsed.
Yeah, and they did all kinds of things. In Lithuania, they were the Soviet Union was trying to Russify them, trying to make them more Russian, and was prohibiting people from singing Lithuanian folk songs in their own Lithuanian language. So people went outside and they sang folk songs in their own traditional language, and it's been referred to as the singing revolution. And how do you stop that? And there are just so many different kinds of things that bit by bit people realize we don't have to put up with this anymore. We're not going to take it.
Well, and Glenn, I raised a question too about, does this work in a militarized society? And we just need to look at the Philippines. There was some violence, yes, but for the most part, that country had a turnover in governments, nonviolent.
But in about, 1976 or thereabouts? It's been a few decades now.
A little later than that, but it was Ferdinand Marcos. Who is often called the Hitler of Southeast Asia.
Oh, yeah.
That's how brutal
he was our U.S. ally. We kept pumping up his military. But it was late 70s when that ferment was happening, and I don't remember the exact year. But and there are quite a lot of these in different places. Even in Iran, which briefly had a democracy in the early 50s, in about 1953, the CIA from the U.S. and the British intelligence overthrew their democracy, and we installed the Shah of Iran, and who was a brutal tyrant. And in fact, it got so bad that Amnesty International, by the time he was overthrown, Amnesty International said that he had the world's worst human rights record of anybody in the world. And the U.S. kept pumping money into their military, giving them military supplies and selling them weapons, so that a subcommittee of the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee studied the situation, and they concluded in a formal report that the U.S. weapons sales program to Iran was out of control. That's a quote from them, out of control. And the U.S. Senate is not a radical left-wing peace-knit organization, but they knew that. And so when the people of Iran, mostly young people, and almost entirely nonviolently, overthrew the Shah, they knew who had been propping up that dictatorship. And the United States built helicopters that we had sold to them, were flying down the streets of Tehran to just machine gunning people who were peacefully protesting. But it's still, the Shah couldn't stand up when the people said, we're just not going to take this anymore, and they poured out into the streets and said, you're out of here.
You know, a while back, Lynn, Lieutenant Aaron Watada gave a real interesting statement. He said, do you want this war to end, in essence? I'm paraphrasing him now. He says, when soldiers refuse to fight and when citizens refuse to pay for war, there will be no war.
So, Glenn, you just said something that showed how much courage this can take. The most brutal dictator in the world, according to Amnesty International, and the people pour into the streets to say no more. So what were they potentially sacrificing by walking out there? And they still did it. It takes so much courage.
It is, let's see. People often, well, many people who work for nonviolence or who use nonviolence to work for social justice and peace come at this from religious motivations, religious insights and belief and faith. A lot of people come at it from a purely pragmatic thing. Gene Sharp, whom we've talked about, says, I'm not a pacifist, I just work on nonviolence, and I'm not coming at it from a religious basis. I just support nonviolence because that's what works the best. And he's really clear. He likes to tell people that he's not a pacifist, but he supports nonviolence just because it's so practical, so effective. Both of you are active in Veterans for Peace, which is not a religious organization, but it's strongly committed to nonviolence. And you have a copy of the Statement of Purpose.
I do. As a matter of fact, I'd like to show the slide to our viewing audience there, because we all, actually in our meetings, we go through this every time. Our Statement of Purpose says, we having dutifully served our nation, do hereby affirm the greater responsibility to serve the cause of world peace. And to this end, we'll work with others. And here are the statements that we have. And Jody?
Toward increasing public awareness of the costs of war.
See, that's one of the reasons that we have the Arlington Northwest, is to show the ultimate cost of war.
And that's the display of
That's the display of all the grave markers, yes. To restrain our government from intervening overtly and covertly in the internal affairs of other nations. That's why we had Father Roy Bourgeois here speaking on the School of America's watch.
To end the arms race and to reduce and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons.
And you were at Bangor once, weren't you?
I like getting arrested at Bangor, actually. It's one of the joys of my life.
The Trident nuclear submarine base, just about 60 miles out of Olympia.
That might have the most nuclear weapons of any place in the entire world.
Yeah, if Kitsap County were a nation, it would be the third most, the nation with the third most nuclear weapons after the rest of the U.S. and Russia. And then third in the world is Kitsap County.
The Dalai Lama has said it's the biggest threat to us, is nuclear weapons.
And Raymond Hunthausen, the former Archbishop, Catholic Archbishop, referred to it as the Auschwitz of Puget Sound.
Interesting.
So,
the fourth statement is to abolish war as an instrument of national policy. See, we don't have a Department of Peace. I mean, basically, we have a Department of War. We now call it Department of State. But it's really
Department of Defense. They changed the name in the late 40s.
Yeah.
And when they became more warlike, as in a persistent way, and then they said, "Oh no, we have to call this defense now."
Yes.
To make nonviolent conflict resolution an integral part of national policy.
Okay, so there you have it. So Veterans for Peace, you folks and lots of others who belong to VFP, are actually explicitly supporting nonviolent conflict resolution. So,
and it's coming down from the top, from the national headquarters of VFP, are beginning to do trainings among all of the chapters.
Okay.
And finally, is to seek justice for veterans and victims of war. And that doesn't mean just U.S. Soldiers that have been affected by war, but those in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. And so we really believe that this is a very important part here. And so we say this together, maybe Jody and I, to achieve these goals, members of Veterans for Peace pledge to use nonviolent means and to maintain an organization that is both democratic and open with the understanding that all members are trusted to act in the best interest of the group,
for the larger purpose of world peace.
So there's another affirmation explicitly for nonviolent action as the way to go. So that's really cool. Let's see. One of the reasons why nonviolence works so well is that it uses means that are consistent with the ends. Some people will glibly say, well, the ends can justify the means. It doesn't work that way. Things don't work that way. The means, the methods that we use are like planting seeds for the society that we want to grow. And if we want to grow a world that's peaceful and just, we have to use only those methods that are peaceful and just. And so if we use nonviolence in what we do and how we do things, we'll end up with a nonviolent world. People who think, well, let's have this little revolutionary vanguard of a few of us tough macho guys who will go out and do little acts of revolutionary violence here and there, and that'll bring us to the promised land, that'll bring us to the new society. Trouble is, you end up with a new society with a few tough macho guys on top, and then all of us who are oppressed by the old regime are just now oppressed by a new regime, and all you've done is change the figureheads at the top. What nonviolence does is, because it is so much based on humane values, the kinds of things that you read earlier that King supported, the new society is based on those humane values, and so if we rely on nonviolent methods, we're creating a society that will actually embody those values, and then we've got a society that we can all live in, including those of us who are not tough macho guys. Nonviolent resistance, the story you had out of Nazi Germany, and stories of people doing nonviolent resistance in all kinds of other places, include not just young, healthy, physically fit macho guys, but people of all ages, women just as much as men, elderly people, little kids, people with disabilities, everybody, poor people as well as others. And so then you're sowing the seeds of a society that has everybody in charge. Everybody has a stake in the new society, and it's profoundly democratic because everybody helped to bring it about. And it's just a whole different dynamic than the kind of a revolutionary vanguard with a few young, physically fit macho guys. Gandhi had urged us to be the change that you want to see in the world, and I just find that to be powerful. It's practicing what we preach. It's walking the talk. So the questions come up about, well, what about graffiti or property damage and stuff? And some people will say, well, is that violence or is that not violence? And my concern, I happen to think that those are violent because they show disrespect for people, but they also are sowing the seeds of a society that I don't want to have. If somebody wants to come to power by breaking other people's windows, then if those people come to power and we don't like what they do, should we be breaking their windows? That's the precedent that they've set. And I don't want that precedent. If somebody thinks vandalism, spray painting on somebody's wall is the way to go, would they like it if we spray painted on their wall, on their car, on their house, whatever? I mean, it just is the wrong dynamic. And so whether you call that violence or not, and some people disagree as to whether that's violent or not, it's the wrong means. It sows the seeds of a society that we don't want. And I'd much rather have a society where we consistently show respect for the human dignity of each of us and all of the stuff that we do and have and practice.
It just reminded me of a story that happened in Billings, Montana. I bet you know this. You'll probably fill in spaces for me,
ahead.
Parts of the story.
Tell it kind of quickly because we're running a bit tight.
There were some Jewish families in town, and there was some aggression towards them, like rocks through the window when they put their menorah up. The community responded in a way that said, on bulletin boards, they said everyone is welcome here, and they had sales on menorahs, and the local paper printed a menorah in full scale, so that they say 6,000 to 10,000 menorahs were put in windows of Christian families, so that so that they couldn't be singled out. Individual Jewish families couldn't be singled out. And they did this the next year also, saying that we are a community together. We will stand together. We will not let these people be singled out. We are a community.
Yeah, and that's solidarity. I mean, it's a good old word from the labor movement and other movements from decades ago, but that worked. That's solidarity. We're all in this together.
That's the world I want to live in.
Yeah.
Not one that separates.
Right. And so the nonviolence ethic is we're all in this together. And we have a problem that we have to solve, but we can all solve it together.
Yes.
And I don't solve it in a way that works for me at your expense. So, cool. Thanks for sharing that. When we were preparing for the program, you mentioned Gandhi's emphasis of what he called the constructive program. Tell us about that.
Gandhi's worked for decades on how to free his country, but his primary work, he said towards the end, 90% of his work were toward constructive programs, how to feed his people, how to clothe his people, how to do it so that it creates a stronger society. His constructive programs weren't about, they were effective in kicking off the Brits, but they were, help me.
It was building a new society with the values that would work in his community.
Yes.
He wanted village-level economics and local sustainability, things that we would now call local sustainability.
Yes.
So you produce your own cloth locally, and you grow your own food, and you take care of your own needs, and you do this in a way that empowers people, and otherwise you end up kicking out the British colonial power with its big corporations, and you just end up with new
and replacing it
Indian
with the same
corporations,
power structure.
same process, but just Indian people running it instead of British. And he wanted to have that more thoroughgoing thing, and so he was constructing the new society.
So what he said is 90% of our work should be towards construction instead of demolition.
I ran across a quotation from Buckminster Fuller after you told me that on the phone when we were preparing for this. Buckminster Fuller said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete."
Yes.
I like that.
Isn't that cool?
I like that.
So, okay. Tell us about the 2 hands of nonviolence, because I think that fits in.
Oh, it's very simple. What you're doing when you're being nonviolent is you're saying, no, that's wrong. I will not allow you to do this. And yes, we are both humans. We are in this together. What can we do so this is right? I will not let you do this, and I will still be here. So the 2 hands of nonviolence.
We talked on the phone, Dennis, about where this leads, and part of where it leads is larger level campaigns for nonviolent social and political and other kinds of changes that are very strategic and very well thought through. And sometime in a few months we'll have to do a TV program that looks at that, because there's a whole lot that can be said. But I wonder if you could take like 1 minute or less and say something about that for now, and then people will have to tune in a few months and catch the rest of this.
Well, one of the things, Glenn, that we talked about is there is a new game that's out now called a Force More Powerful game. And one of the things I'd like to see the Fellowship of Reconciliation do is have game night, where you come in and you actually do some strategy playing on this game. The other one that we're looking at is the type of literature and movies that our kids watch that solve problems nonviolently. And so I think that's a whole program in the future.
Okay. And these are all in the context of looking ahead to the big thing. It's not like, who's going to win the next election or any of this kind of stuff. These are at a larger scale. Back to the Gandhi quote about if you're going to fix things, you got to start with the kids. I don't recall the exact wording, but that sense that, and Gandhi had said that very famously, and other people have said that too. And so to work on the large scale problems that our society faces of militarism and economic injustice and all the different social injustices, these are big long-term campaigns, and they need a very careful strategy.
They do.
And they need consistent nonviolence at every step along the way, but we got to be waging peace. Our government knows how to wage war, and the people need to develop skills better in how to wage peace and how to wage social change movements.
Well, one of the slides that I'd like to show right now is actually a picture of Gandhi and the quote that he gave that you just alluded to. If we're to have real peace, we must begin with the children. And all too often, right now, I think even within the Fellowship of Reconciliation and Veterans for Peace, we're working on adults. And yet, if we're to affect the next generation, we need to start looking at what we do with children.
That's lovely.
We should mention also that you mentioned the force more powerful. There's that game, but there's the book, a big thick book that explains in about like 60 pages per chapter a number of, I think it's like 13 different nonviolent action campaigns. The solidarity movement in Poland and Gandhi's Salt March, and integrating the lunch counters in Nashville, Tennessee, and just quite a lot in different parts of the world throughout the 1900s. Very powerful, very informative, very inspiring. And then there's a video series that does 30-minute episodes of each of these, of each of 6 of these. And we've shown those locally. We've gotten the meeting room at the Olympia Library on alternating Sunday afternoons, and we'd show an episode for 30 minutes and discuss it for an hour and a half, and end up with very rich, thought-provoking, deep discussions. And I'd love to see more of that, because people were really getting into how can we apply that here. And
well, and the nature of this game actually goes a step beyond the video series and the book and says, okay, here is a scenario. What are you going to do about it? I'll show just a real quick couple of slides there, because I know we have a short one.
Yeah.
This slide that's up right now is the sort of a screenshot of a force more powerful. And it's a game that really immerses you in simulated conflicts. And you try to take a look. They're fictionalized, but they're very realistic. And it's a whole game strategy, and you put on a role as a planner for a non-violent movement seeking a social change. And it's demanding. Sometimes it could be even dangerous. And there's just some really interesting things that you could do in playing this game. It's a computerized game, and so I'm going to encourage more people to call FOR and see about setting up a game night.
Okay, and we'll have the phone number on at the end of the show. If you just can't wait till the end of the show, it's 491-9093. But that's
just
we'll have
read
it
that
on
from
the
the top of his head. For how many years?
Yeah, it's the same. We've had the same phone number for over 30 years, so that helps. So what else might you recommend for a society to become less violent? If our society were to have like a society-wide conversation about, have we about had it with violence in our society? Do we want to move toward a non-violent society? Wouldn't that be a great thing to have a big public conversation about extending over a stretch of time, and see if the public can say enough is enough, we want to do something different? How might we, what might we do if we wanted to have a more nonviolent society?
The trainings are a start. The Fellowship of Reconciliation puts on training.
Yeah, and we've all been through that, and other folks have too.
Learning how to listen, practicing how to listen. I've vigiled many, many days out on the Capitol campus, and often alone, and had very pissed off people come up towards me. If I can just be there with them and listen long enough, then we can move into beautiful conversation. And I'm really grateful that I've had that practice. How do we practice among each other so that we can listen to the alternatives?
Another thing would be to take a look at what things in our society actually contribute to us being a violent community, and then what can we do to change that? You mentioned earlier that I was doing some work on war toys. Well, then what kind of toys can we supplement that are not war toys? Or even the media we're looking at. I look at the public service announcements, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, those are promoting violence, and the fact that they're all militarized.
Our news is all about the worst of what's happening instead of the best.
It creates the illusion that there's violence all around us, and you better hunker down and get a gun and protect yourself from whatever.
27 minutes of violence and maybe 3 minutes of good news.
And not reach out and be in community.
Yeah.
I think it would be fun to sit down with some folks and think about what would a nonviolent economy be like. You know, we have, when you, earlier in the program, you were talking about the various kinds of violence. You know, if there's a big gap between the rich and the poor, and some people are really having to do without, that's economic violence. What would a nonviolent society look like? A society that's not premised on the notion of winners and losers, or healthcare for profit, rather than, you know, I was just reading before we taped the program, I was reading a magazine about Uruguay, which is a little dinky South American country, free health care for everybody, universal health care, and it's all free. And they have education that's free up through the university level. Iraq used to have free education all the way up to the university level until we invaded it. And they used to have free health care for everybody until we invaded and destroyed that. But a lot of countries actually have free health care for everybody. And free, you know, what would a nonviolent society look like? What could we do here? Or what would a nonviolent criminal justice system look like? You know, if we could reinvent a criminal justice system based on these principles of nonviolence that we've been talking about. I mean, what creative potential there is for people to re-engineer our society.
We mentioned 2 civilizations earlier that lived for 1,500 years without war. It was unimaginable to me before I read about this and believed it. And one of the primary ideas of what created that is an equal distribution of wealth. In both of those societies.
I also saw, some time ago, somebody had done research about the wealth gap, you know, how much gap between rich and poor, and lifespan in different countries. And they found a correlation there that if you have a society, a country, that has a pretty fair distribution of wealth, so you don't have these big gaps between rich and poor, they had a better overall lifespan. The places with big gaps between the rich and the poor have shorter lifespans on the average overall. Interesting to play with that, and again, to deepen and broaden our understanding of violence and nonviolence, and then apply it to the real world, and then use nonviolent methods to get to where we want to go. I mean, we got a lot of work cut out for us.
Yes.
What would you like our viewers to do in light of all the things that we've been discussing? What would you encourage the viewers to be doing?
Talk with your neighbors.
Talk with your children.
Learning to, studying these stories so that we can share them. Studying stories of hope and share those. What inspires you? Not the things that scare you, but those that inspire you. Let's talk about those. Stop listening to the news in this way that creates fear.
Seek out alternative news that has better accuracy than the corporate
and do some reflection on why do I believe the way I believe? Why do I think the way I think?
You mentioned talk with neighbors. Talk with people who aren't your neighbors.
Who are different, who have different beliefs than you have. Practice
talk
that.
with people who live in either a richer or poorer neighborhood, or talk with strangers.
I've noticed how neighbors talk to each other after the elections are over with and they take down their political signs. Now it's safe to start talking again, but for a while they put up the signs and we don't talk to each other.
Camp Quixote is happening right now. It's a homeless encampment, and they're looking for people to be there and greet passersby and pass out information. What an opportunity to talk with people, the Camp Quixote people, who are in a different economic bracket than you are, and to see the society that they're creating. Yes,
very democratic and inclusive and warm place. We have like 30 seconds for each of you to do a closing pitch of whatever sort.
I want to give another source of just where they can get some information on thinking about these things. And there's a slide that I want to show right now. This is a screenshot from criticalconcern.com. And criticalconcern.com brings up things on Iraq. It brings up things on Haiti. It also has children's books and nonviolence. There's just a variety of tools. So I encourage people to continue looking for those resources. Even our Veterans for Peace, Chapter 1009, there's a link from that to our website. But I encourage people to start thinking nonviolently.
Okay.
One more quick story from Jesus when he talked about if someone asks you to carry a pack 1 mile, carry it the extra mile. It's not just giving in. Once again, it's Roman soldiers could only have you carry this pack for this particular distance because they didn't want to impose too much on the people they were controlling. So if you continue to carry that pack, that soldier could get in trouble. Imagine the soldier begging for his pack back while you trod down the road. It's nonviolence, and that's what Jesus was talking about.
And it brings into mind the notion of why should a foreign occupying army be able to make you carry the pack even the first mile?
Yes.
I mean, it just shines a bright spotlight on the inherent oppression.
Yes.
Well, thank you both. War and other forms of violence just don't work. Military solutions only make the problems worse. David Dellinger, one of the great peace activists of past decades, said, "Just as it would be stupid to plant weeds and try to harvest vegetables, so it would be stupid to encourage the lies, conscription, and murder of war and hope to produce democracy, freedom, and brotherhood. War is a Trojan horse from which emerge at home the enemies that destroy us." Martin Luther King said, "Nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time, the need for mankind to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to oppression and violence." And so here's what I believe. Visionaries say that the way to create a revolution is to practice it now, to start living the new society now, because this will help bring it into being. Martin Luther King urged us to create what he called the beloved community, and that's the new society in which every person's rights and dignity are profoundly valued, and in which our culture is rooted in nonviolence and social justice. That's the beloved community. Jesus told us that the kingdom of God is within you, and based on what these folks are saying, we can live that new society into being by starting to practice it right now. So I want to thank Dennis Mills and Jody Tiller. I want to thank all the folks who've been watching. For information about a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolence, call the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 360-491-9093 or visit www.olyfor.org. We're all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs exactly what you have to offer. Thanks.